The first one is going to be moderated by Tony Tiu. Tony is Chief Executive of Renewables in Africa. He has a long history consulting in that space, and in particular, thought leadership and publication in that area. But I'll leave Tony to talk more about the topic and introduce his panel. Tony.
Okay, just going to give a chance to my fellow colleague just to sit, and we're going to have a fantastic conversation. So, good morning, all of you. It's a pleasure to see you here. So I have to say, Ari, that was a wonderful conversation. And Jonathan never mentioned to me that we're going to talk about financing for my company, Renewables in Africa. And I sat there and I looked at about 4 to 5 slides. I was like, that's wonderful news. I definitely would take it. So, I don't know if you like me, but that's the first time I have the privilege to come back to an in-person conference. I know some people are watching us online. And that's great. That's great. That's great. Why? Simply because now we have to properly dress up, right? So, because, you know, about 6 months to a year ago, you only have to dress up to here. What is beyond that, nobody knows, right? You almost have to wonder and ask the question to yourself, you know, is dressing up obsolete? So I leave it to you the chance to respond to this question. Maybe this is what has inspired our colleagues here to set up a panel where we're going to be discussing whether the grid is obsolete. Yeah? So that's the linkage I can see there. And when I looked at the question, I was thinking, that's a weird question. Usually when you have such a question, the answer will be no, right? But I'm sure there is a reason why we're asking ourselves this question. And we are quite privileged because we're going to have a panel here to discuss it. So what I'm going to do, because we only have 40 minutes to run this panel, but I'm sure you have lots of questions you want to ask. But we're going to do our best to get the question from the speaker, but also involve you. So I'm just going to turn around my colleagues here. So there are 4 of them. So I'm just going to ask, I don't know, you want to maybe start introducing yourself and say to people who you are, please?
Of course. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, I'm Arnaud Schalk. I'm investment officer at Proparco, in charge of energy, decentralized energy, our decentralized energy activity in Africa. Proparco is a subsidiary of the French Development Agency, focused on the private sector. And of course, Proparco as a DFI has strong impact objective to double our impact and to double our financing toward the SDG. And for that, obviously, infrastructure and energy and decentralized energy is really at the core of our strategy. And in Africa, it completely makes sense due to the specificity of the continent with really dense urban area, less than or more isolated rural area. So decentralized energy and new type of electrification makes sense. So for that, we've been equipped. We are equipped with different tools, the typical tool, equity, loan, debt, technical assistance, and we work strongly in collaboration with the French Development Agency to develop some TA and to support the government in that. And we have a dedicated tool today on energy access, which is called the African Renewable Energy Scale-Up. It's a 20 million equity facility dedicated to support the energy access developer in Africa.
Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to move now to Emilio, please, if you can carry on.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm Emilio Cattaneo. I am the head of technical assistance at the Private Infrastructure Development Group. PIDG is a multi-donor funded organization with capital from the UK government, the Swiss, Swedish, Dutch, Australian governments, as well as KfW and the World Bank. We've been around since 2002. We work at all stages of the infrastructure development cycle, principally in the case of Africa through 3 companies. At the early development stage, we have our colleagues at Infraco Africa who effectively develop projects with high-risk early-stage equity. And then we have two companies that are involved in the longer-term financing of projects. One is Garanco, which was mentioned earlier, which is a provider of credit enhancements and guarantees. And the other one is the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, which is a long-term project finance, project debt provider. We have been very active in the renewable sector, and increasingly we're becoming active in the off-grid. And during my intervention later, I mentioned some of the projects that we've been involved in. Just to give you a few numbers, so since 2002, when PIDGE was created, we've deployed just under $5 billion worth of capital across these various product areas. 170 plus projects have come into operation. And 50% of what we do tends to be in the fragile and conflict-affected states. So we kind of have quite a high-risk appetite in terms of the geography to work with. And we cover most of the African markets, sort of north of South Africa. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So please go. Go ahead, Marina.
Thank you, Tony. My name is Marina. I'm working for FMO, Dutch Development Bank. Name was mentioned a couple of times this morning already. We celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. It was during COVID, so not a big party, but still, we're there. That is important. We have 3 focus sectors. This is agriculture, food and water, financial institutions, and energy. And within the energy department, we focus on renewable energy. So we're going to probably sign our last gas-to-power plant next week or the week thereafter. And within our department, we're active both in the off-grid as well as the on-grid sector. So we still do the bigger projects, but definitely also going forward focusing on distributed energy. We started already 10 years ago with solar home system investments and funding, and moving on to mini-grids as well as commercial and industrial. And we do that both on the equity as well as the debt side. So we have a venture capital fund. We are one of the partners or establishers of CIO or CFM that provides construction equity until COD, after which part of the project is refinanced. Thank you. Refinanced by debt. Yeah, that was it from my side, actually.
Okay, thanks for that. So Susie, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Susie Scnelly-Cook. I'm here representing Empower New Energy. Now, we are slightly different from what my colleagues here on the panel are doing. We came into the market in 2017 to bridge this financing gap that we found very relevant and not really being looked at. It's something that Gigawatt Global were mentioning this morning. We are there to find innovative ways to finance smaller scale projects in renewable energy. We finance projects from 0.5 megawatt upwards through to 10 megawatts up to 20, which would be the limit of our mandate. And what we've found out over the years, and which is why Empower exists, is that there's a real desire and need and drive in the continent of Africa and across the emerging markets, really, to be able to establish profitable, clean energy for communities and for the C&I space. So that's what Empower is there to do. We work alongside development agencies, helping on a portfolio level to unlock the way in which development organizations can invest at the smaller end of the spectrum, but also profitably.
Thank you very much for that, Susie. So when I look at the title here, Leapfrogging, will electricity become obsolete in Africa? Normally, we've heard the term leapfrogging in another industry, which is telecom. So you have to wonder, so are we in telecom here? Are we talking about energy? And that's why I'd like you, Emilio, to tell us, first of all, when you hear the term leapfrogging, is it appropriate for the industry? Are we looking here to replace completely the grid or just to strengthen the grid? So what's your take on it? And if you can give us maybe a couple of examples to illustrate what you're saying.
Thank you, Tony. I don't think personally that the term is appropriate or applicable. I think the development of the mobile industry some years ago faced very different challenges to the ones that we see today in the off-grid market. First of all, the industry was able to rely on substantial demand created in urban centers, which allowed sort of rapid development of the telecom companies and provided strong and predictable cash flows. And then using those revenues, the telecom providers as well as the telecom tower companies were able to roll out infrastructure in the more rural area, basically depending on some of the cash flows that created in cities. So the industry was actually commercially viable from the very early stage and didn't require any element of subsidy. And I think subsidy is an important word because it's something that we see a lot as being a necessity at the moment in the off-grid industry. So DFIs did provide financing to the telecom tower industry, but that was quickly replaced with private capital from bank and investors. So, so I think it is different. The reason, I think, the principal reason why there is such a difference is that unlike in the telecom sector, there is no secure off-taker for mini-grids. There is no easily forecastable demand. So projects effectively struggle to become commercial unless they can have access to subsidies, particularly in the early days. Just to give you some numbers, I mean, FCDO, one of our shareholders, is very active in Sierra Leone providing funding support through grants for the off-grid industry there, I think in the region of about $45 million. The World Bank has a large program for Nigeria to the tune of $150 million in subsidies. And we ourselves at Pidge, on a very much smaller scale, have provided both technical assistance grants as well as capital grants to the development of a number of mini-grids across the continent in areas like Sierra Leone, Kenya, and looking at projects in DRC and Rwanda. So I think subsidization still continues to be very important, especially as you enter into new geographic markets. So why do we face these challenges in the industry? I think these topics will be picked up by some of my co-panelists going forward, but just to sort of summarize, I think the first one is a limited availability of private capital due to the long payback periods of mini-grids and the relatively limited returns. And part of the reason for that is that the actual size of the mini-grids individually is quite small. So your average mini-grid will be $100,000 to $500,000 in terms of cost. That's below the radar screen of most investors, whether institutional or private. And so it's only through the aggregation of projects into portfolio that we're now seeing much more interest and much more ability of private investors to come in. And so some of the platforms such as SunFunder and PowerGen, for example, with whom Pidge is working, are starting to enable that environment for investors to come in. I think PowerGen now manages about 100 projects in the region, which is quite substantial. So the second point, which I alluded to earlier, is that the demand is unpredictable. You don't quite know how consumers are going to react when you install the grid. I mean, clearly the demand is there, it's whether the ability to pay for that supply exists. And so you do have to create a number of productive uses around the mini-grid. So sort of stimulate agribusiness, use it for irrigation, cold storage, warehousing, and so on. You can do it through appliance releasing or rental type models, which is what the solar home systems have done, and therefore stimulate more consumption. Or you could do it through some contracts with local authorities, powering clinics, schools, or powering street lighting, and that gives you an element of sort of more secure funding. The third issue, I think, is the lack of regulation. I mean, there is still a lot of uncertainty around the licensing of mini-grid sites and the tariffs that you can apply to the consumer. On the tariff side, many countries in Africa are clearly not charging cost-reflective tariffs on their grid connections, and there is an element of subsidy to grid consumers. That at the moment is not available to the off-grid, and I think some legislation needs to come in place in a number of countries in order to provide that sort of support, perhaps to then offset the subsidies that are provided by multilaterals for the actual capex of the project. And then there's the issue of licensing, and particularly what happens with areas that then become covered by the grid. So, for example, in Kenya, there is legislation where anything within 15 kilometers of the grid cannot be licensed for a mini-grid, but that doesn't mean that there's actually a short-term plan of the grid to expand to these regions. And so you might find a lot of people are actually going to be unable to have access to mini-grids. And indeed, if mini-grids were built beyond that, there's very little clarity in terms of potential compensation that might be provided to developers whose mini-grid then becomes sort of grid-connected. So, and then the final point, I think, which is one which has been alluded to before, is the foreign exchange risk. I mean, like all infrastructure, the revenues tend to be in local currency, the costs tend to be in hard currency. And I think it's hard to apply the kind of solution that Garanco has managed to apply to larger infrastructure projects to the mini-grid sector, to make sure that it's not the consumers that absorb the tariff escalation due to foreign exchange impacts. So just to say a few words about Page. So we are active both as a developer and a lender, investor in the sector. Our two Infraco companies, Infraco Africa and Infraco Asia, are probably becoming one of the largest or two of the largest developers of mini-grids in their respective Asian and African geographies. We Page through Infraco Africa, again, we're probably one of the first developers of a mini-grid on Bugala Island in Uganda. That's the Kalangala multi-infrastructure sector project. And we developed 6 years ago a 1.5 megawatt solar and battery and hybrid grid there. And it's on the back of some of that experience that we've actually started to also look to develop mini-grids ourselves over the last 3 or 4 years. We're looking, as I said earlier, in projects in Sierra Leone, Kenya, Rwanda, DRC, and elsewhere. So just to complete with an example, we are working in Sierra Leone with PowerGen. Sierra Leone has a rural rate of electrification which is just under 5%, one of the lowest in sub-Saharan Africa. The government is very committed to renewables and particularly is supporting off-grid as part of their energy action plan. And we have been able to, again, supported by some of the FCDO funding I mentioned earlier, to develop a portfolio, are developing a portfolio of about 12,500 connections, $7 million of equity invested by Infraco Africa at the very early development stage alongside PowerGen. And we hope that those mini-grids are scheduled to go on become operational towards the end of this year, early next year. The bulk of that power, 80% or so, will go to consumer, and the rest is very much destined to these productive uses that I mentioned earlier. So as a conclusion, I don't think that the off-grid and on-grid models will, I think both will survive. I think both are very relevant. Grid will continue to be critically important in urban centers, but I think we are going to see much, much more relevance and importance of the off-grid in the rural segments.
Thanks for that, Emilio. So I think you mentioned a number of points here. I'm sure we're going to come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to stop a minute and say that our company, Renewables in Africa, our vision, what we see, is to have a fully electrified continent by 2040. Why 2040? Because realistically speaking, I don't... Thank you very much. Now you can hear me better? I think that's okay. Okay, so I was saying that our vision is to electrify Africa by 2040. Why 2040? Because I personally don't believe that 2030 is doable. That's our personal goal. But if we say that, it's good to put things into context, because we say 600 million people are unelectrified. What does that mean? For example, if we say that we need to reach that by 2030, that we have less than 10 years, that means every year we need to electrify 60 million people. That's about the size of South Africa. Yeah? So that's what we're talking about. And the reason I'm talking about that is because for me, and I think for many of you, what I like to remind myself is we need to talk about scale. Scale is very, very important. So how do we achieve scale? So that's the key question here. The grid at the moment is partly responsible for that, having those 600 million people that are not electrified. Yeah? And that's the reason we're asking ourselves the question here. So can we rely only on the grid? I think part of the question would be most likely not the case. I think we need to have some alternative option here. That's what we're talking about, off-grid. Now, off-grid, and I want to turn to Marina. Off-grid, we know that one of the main issues is basically the economic viability, because like I say, 600 million people needs to be electrified. If you think about the fact that you need about a gigawatt to electrify about 1 million people, just make it think simple. I know it's not exactly that, but roughly that. So that means we need 600 gigawatts to electrify all these people. That's what we're talking about. Can we get off-grid to pick up, I would say, even a third of it? So what is the mechanism that we can put in place? And I know we talked a lot about the issue that we are seeing, but the thing is, we all know the issues. So how can we start talking about some solutions that are already working? So my question for you, Marina, is very simple. So how can we get off-grid to pick up part of the job that needs to be done, 600 gigawatts of people, even a third of that, if off-grid can do that? And secondly, so what are the examples that you've seen working in some countries and that can be replicated?
Thank you for the question. I wish the answer was equally simple as the question, Tony. Yeah, what we see as FMO, and this is also the basis for our strategy going forward, is that every solution has its place going forward. So we have established our strategy around transmission, distribution, storage, and distributed energy, because we feel those three sectors or subsectors are very important going forward to achieve the full energy access. And I'm not going to give you a year, 2030, 2040, or beyond my life, I suppose, 2050, but hopefully sooner rather than later. And next to that, we will continue to invest in on-grid bigger projects. But there, in that sector, we see that there's a lot of liquidity and a lot of interest from also commercial banks and other commercial investors. On the T&D side, there is a need to strengthen the transmission and distribution capabilities in many countries on the continent. And one example is Uganda. So Uganda, from a generation perspective, is at par with the demand. But the problem is transmission distribution, as all of you may know. So they urgently need strengthening of that. One of the issues there is that T&D by nature is a public sector play, and FMO and also other development banks are a private sector play. So we need to find a solution there. But we do see that also the Ugandan government is thinking about how to privatize their T&D sector. So we're gonna get there. It will take time, but we're gonna get there. And it also applies to countries like Kenya, for example. In terms of storage, we see that battery storage, well, maybe it's not leapfrogging, but it's really developing at a fast pace. So lithium batteries, applications in projects is happening. It's happening in Malawi. It's hopefully going to happen in South Africa with a big project that's going to be developed by Scatec. And it's happening in other countries on the continent as well. Hydrogen, obviously, the word, I suppose, these days. It will take time, but also that's going to be a good solution for the continent, both for North Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe for the moment, mostly in South Africa. And then distributed energy. We're dividing that into solar home systems, mini-grids, and commercial and industrial. And what we see is, so in solar home systems, we have been active now since 10 years or a bit more as FMO. This market is still early stage, but you do see companies now becoming profitable and becoming a play for commercial banks. Like an example of that is M-Kopa, where they're raising a lot of money, and one of the commercial banks, South African commercial banks, is heavily involved in that fundraising. Mini-grids, very much at the start, and what is needed there are a lot of subsidies. I think to make it happen, you need 40, 50, maybe even sometimes 60% subsidies. And that can be in many forms, right? In terms of CAPEX or governments providing the grid connections. You can think of a lot of solutions there. And in the mini-grid space, it has been mentioned by you, Emilio, Nigeria, Sierra Leone is happening. Uganda is happening, Zambia is coming. So all these countries that lack the big T&D capacity are very much looking at mini-grids, and I sincerely believe that this is, for these countries, a solution alongside on-grid. I do want to emphasize that to achieve the scale that Mr. Green mentioned before. And then commercial industrial, that's coming as well, and this also has to do with more flexible legislation. An example of that is South Africa, but there are other examples as well. And C&I is, I suppose, mostly a play for bigger commercial companies, but definitely still interesting for FMO as a development bank. So I hope I answered all your questions.
Thank you. That was a very good attempt. I appreciate that. I appreciate
good attempt,
that.
okay.
So I think I'm going to come to you in a minute, Arno. So one thing as well that we know is that's obviously some stat out there. The population of Africa is going to double by 2050. That's what we all agree. And a good proportion of that population will be residing in cities. In fact, we're going to have more than, I think, 40 cities. I think that will have more than 5 million people. That's actually quite huge. Now, if you're talking about fully electrifying the continent, it means that we also need to understand where is the demand going to come from. So most likely, it's going to be those cities. And we all agree that if we're talking about cities, we would like to think that grid may be the solution, but not only, because we all need to work together. I'm sure you heard about this African word, Ubuntu, right, which is about togetherness, right, working all together. So in the spirit of togetherness, we need to have both grid and off-grid working together. And the public sector plays an important role, especially for people like us working from the private sector. So Arno, according to you, because I think you've been doing fantastic work with your company, what role do you see the public sector playing in this challenge that we're looking to solve? And I want you particularly to talk to me about and to talk to us about some of the examples that you've seen in GRC, please.
Yeah, working now. Yeah, okay. No, just to take a step back, obviously electrification is part of the top priority of the government, so it's a really political vision, and the government are really at the end of defining a strategy. So we believe that it starts there, and we believe that the comprehensive policy framework is really maybe the start of a strategy of electrification. So it's not a question of is it the grid or is it off-grid, it's how do you want to electrify the 600 million person that is in the continent. And obviously this comes from some stuff that are quite obvious. It's in 10 years, the off-grid sector would be the least cost option for the underserved population, for 50% of the underserved population, so that makes sense. And as well, without energy, it's difficult to have economical and social development. As well, this development in parallel, so that's what we're seeing, it's a development in parallel of the grid and the off-grid to serve all the needs, and as well to serve and to guarantee the continuity of the service for the C&I sector, the commercial and industrial sector. So we believe that the government play a big role on that. That's what is interesting to be part of a DFI with and a partner of the French Development Agency, is because we can work end-to-end and help the government and the private sector to go to the same direction. So the AFD, the French Development Agency, work with the government to define this comprehensive policy framework, and it's really to define a roadmap of electrification. And what, as a private sector, what do we want to see in this roadmap? I'm not gonna say everything, and I think it's gonna be more a synthesis of what has been said today. But the first thing is really to understand how the government want to electrify. Where will be the grid? Where will be the off-grid sector? With which technology will it be electrified? Do we want the grid to supply the commercial and industrial activities, or do we let the autonomy for the private sector? This is really the first question to be understood, because one of the major risks in the off-grid sector is the arrival of the grid in 10 or 20 years, or maybe in 5 years. So that's really the first thing. Then after, it's really all the standardization of the regulation really to develop the project. When we speak about concession, when we speak about licensing, it's extremely important for the developer to have something that is extremely efficient, that is efficient and clear for the developer. Because a licensing process that is not clear, it's a lot of time for the developer, it's cost, so it's major. And this is something that we've seen, for instance, on one of our investing that we supported in Nigeria. We've seen that the licensing for the project of the commercial and industrial was quite clear, allowing this developer, which is Daystar, to really accelerate in their development. So this is something that is really major. Then, obviously, when we speak about mini-grid, it's an infrastructure. To be profitable, we need a long-term vision, so concession and long-term vision and stability on the concession process is a major point as well. And after, we were speaking about one of the major points as well when you are a developer, it's the tariff, the setting of the tariff. And there are a lot of options today, and it's important for the developer as well to have a real vision of how the tariff will be set. Will it be cost reflective, so reflecting all the costs related to the project, or is it a fixed tariff? And if we are speaking about a fixed tariff, do we need subsidies, and where is the subsidies coming? And today, what is interesting to see is that there is a lot of projects, a lot of programs that are being developed on the continent. When we see in Nigeria with the result-based finance project, in Benin, in Togo, all this type of project that set some program with different type of subsidies. So maybe we will go through a standardization, but now it's maybe more some test to then arrive to something that will be more standardized. And yeah, just to illustrate that, I think it's interesting to see one of the country, which is DRC. DRC, we are supporting a mini-grid developer. It's one of the biggest mini-grid developer in Africa, or they develop one of the biggest mini-grid in Africa, which is called Nuru in Goma. They develop a 1 megawatt mini-grid in the city. And what is interesting to see, it's how the collaboration between government and private sector is needed. In DRC, for the mini-grid, the policy was not extremely clear. And we've seen the development between this developer that was doing a first of a kind in the region to work end-to-end with the government to adapt the policy, the licensing process, the concession for this new type of decentralized energy project. And what is interesting to see as well in DRC, once again, this government and the private sector working together, is the ESSOR project, where it's interesting to see the standardization of the documentation, the contractualization, the licensing project and the concession to really make the bidder and the developer in a really clear framework to develop their project. I hope
Thank you very much for that, Arno. I think we have about 10, okay. So just for me to run quickly to Susie, but to say that one of the customers or citizens that the grid is failing are businesses. And we know the growth of a country rely significantly on businesses. You have about 80% of businesses that are actually struggling from power outages. And out of it, 50% of them will be using diesel generator. That opens a huge avenue for C&I sector. And you have to wonder, so how come we don't have enough financing for businesses? ARIA, for example, talk about having funds for pre-development, but what about funds to support businesses that want to go solar? Fortunately, we have one of those players in the room that's looking at financing C&I markets, so that's you, Susie. So I wanted to know, according to you, so how come there are not more of you, looking at setting up such a solution?
Well, it's a juggling act, and I think what Arno's just talked about is standardization of processes, which is absolutely key. So we can't come in and finance anything profitably unless we can get the economies of scale working well, and that's through the standardized process, through standardization of our documents, through the standardization of our due diligence, still to a very good standard, but using a portfolio process of a large number of projects as well. So the C&I space, I think, is still is nascent, but it's an area that, with further investment, I think it can move very, very quickly in the right direction. In terms of, I mean, if you look at Africa in numbers, there's population explosion. It's coming. The desire, the need for electricity is forever going to grow. The amount of losses, I mean, if you look at Nigeria, I read that Nigeria loses around 26 billion US dollars annually through not having stable electricity. And that plays into the C&I space, that plays into business development. So I think, you know, having both the grid working efficiently, decarbonising the grid, also having renewable energy solutions both at the smaller scale and the larger scale, both in the rural and in the urban areas, together will be the perfect mix. But what we have to, what we have to acknowledge is the ability for smaller players like Empower to come in and to trust the financial modelling that we put together, knowing that if we can develop more and more projects on a portfolio basis, we can find a very nifty way to have a lot more projects in play, more electricity being generated at the smaller scale using renewable energy.
Thank you very much for that, Susie. I think, unfortunately, we may have to conclude the panel, but I promised you I was going to get you to participate, even people on the, I would say, that watching us virtually. So I can't take a question for any of you, but I can get you to respond to a question, all of you, right? The question was, when will the electricity grid become obsolete in Africa? So I'm just going to change a little bit to get you to participate. Do you believe that the grid will become obsolete in Africa? Just a show of hands, and I will see what you're thinking. Yes or no? Let's go for yes. Is it going to become obsolete? Only one person. So it's not going to become obsolete. It will stay with no. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have your answer to the question. So thank you very much for the panel. So that was Tony to you from Renewables in Africa. Thank you, and thank you to the speakers.